Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? Today we're exploring something pretty amazing. Gary Zukavs' concept of vertical path relationships. You know how to send in those thought-provoking sources, so we've got excerpts from the vertical path, comparisons of different relationship styles, and even some powerful quotes directly from the seat of the soul. And of course, we have our expert here to help us break it all down. They're fantastic at connecting Zukavs' ideas with insights from psychology and sociology. So let's just dive right in. Zukav talks about these two paths in relationships, the horizontal and the vertical. Horizontal relationships, as we see in the sources, tend to be, well, a bit more transactional, focused on things like appearances, shared responsibilities, or what other people think. There was this one example in the vertical path that really struck me. The idea of a couple staying together just for financial security or social standing, it really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And what's interesting is that Zukov isn't saying those horizontal relationships are automatically bad. They can provide stability and meet certain needs, sure, but the real difference is the lack of that shared intention for growth. On the vertical path, the sources emphasize that the focus shifts. It becomes about internal development, shared values, and a genuine desire to support each other's evolution.
So it's not just about being comfortable, it's about choosing to grow together.
Exactly. It's a more conscious approach, more intentional. Think about couples who meditate together, or those who really encourage each other's personal growth journeys. They're choosing that vertical path.
And wouldn't that connect to Maslow's hierarchy of needs? I mean, if horizontal relationships are about that basic security, maybe the vertical ones are tapping into those higher level needs.
Absolutely. Self-actualization, fulfillment, those are right at the top of Maslow's pyramid. And vertical relationships, with their focus on mutual growth and support, well, they offer a powerful way to actually reach those levels.
So listener, I'd love for you to consider this. Where do your own relationships fall in this spectrum? Are they more horizontal, focus on those external things, or do they lean toward that vertical path of shared growth and evolution? It's a question worth thinking about, isn't it? Now, Zukov goes deep into this idea of authentic power in the seat of the soul, and it's closely tied to building healthy relationships. He says, true power comes from aligning with your soul's purpose and acting with love, integrity, and trust, not from trying to control other people or manipulate them.
And that's where the psychology concept of self-efficacy comes in. Albert Bandura, who really pioneered this theory, found that when we believe in our ability to make good choices, well, we're less likely to give in to those unhealthy urges or be swayed by outside pressure. It's this inner strength that lets us build relationships based on real connection, not on neediness or manipulation.
There's that great Zukov quote from the sources. Saying you can't resist is saying you want permission to act irresponsibly. It's a real challenge to take ownership of our choices, to recognize that even the uncomfortable ones can actually lead to growth, both personally and in our relationships. There's an example in the vertical path about a couple who always argued about chores. Instead of just fighting about who does what, they actually used that conflict to talk about their underlying stresses and needs. That kind of honest communication, it comes from taking responsibility, and it can really lead to a deeper connection and understanding.
What's fascinating is how this lines up with the sociological theory of symbolic interactionism. It says that we create meaning through interacting with others. So by changing how we communicate, choosing authenticity, being vulnerable, we can actually reshape the dynamics of our relationships.
It's like we're rewriting that script of how we relate to each other, moving away from those old patterns of blame and defensiveness. And that brings us to another really interesting aspect of Zukav's work. It might surprise some listeners. He has a very specific view on addiction. And it's not just about substance abuse.
Right, he expands that definition. He says it includes any compulsive behavior that keeps us from being self-aware, anything that blocks our growth. This could show up in so many ways in relationships. Codependency, unhealthy attachments, even the inability to let go of resentment.
That's a pretty different way of looking at it, right? It makes you reevaluate what we usually think of as addiction.
Hmm.
But Zukov isn't just pointing out a problem. He's offering a possible solution. He says spiritual growth is the key to actually healing those deeper wounds that often drive addictive behaviors.
And this connects with what Gabor Mate, an addiction expert, talks about. Mate emphasizes that addiction usually comes from unresolved trauma and a lack of genuine connection.
So Zukov's focus on spiritual growth, on self-awareness and authenticity, that aligns perfectly with what Mate suggests for healing those underlying issues.
Right.
So things like mindfulness or conscious communication, those could be powerful tools here. They could help partners become more aware of their own tendencies, their own addictive patterns, and maybe create space for healing.
Absolutely. It's about Recognizing those patterns and choosing a different path, one that leads to growth and liberation for each person and for the couple.
So listener, as we're going through all of this, it's worth thinking about. Have you considered how unaddressed emotional needs, yours or your partner's, might actually be showing up as addictive patterns in your relationships? It's a tough question, but maybe one that can lead to some powerful insights. Now, let's move from theory to practice. Zukavs gives us some concrete steps we can take to actually cultivate these vertical relationships, these growth-oriented ones we've been talking about. The vertical path highlights things like mindful communication, shared activities that promote growth, and a totally new way of approaching conflict resolution.
What's cool is that Zukov doesn't give a one-size-fits-all answer. He knows every relationship is unique, but he offers these tools as a starting point, a way to shift those dynamics and create a connection that's more conscious, more intentional.
So mindful communication. It sounds simple, but what does that actually look like?
It's about really being present with your partner, truly listening without judgment, responding with empathy, creating a space that's safe for open and honest dialogue.
That connects with Carl Rogers' work on person-centered therapy, doesn't it? He was all about empathy and unconditional positive regard, essential for building healthy relationships. And then there's the idea of these shared activities that help you both grow. What kind of activities are we talking about here?
It could be anything that nurtures that growth, both individually and as a couple. Attending workshops together, trying out spiritual practices, being in nature, even just reading a thought-provoking book together. The key is that you're doing it on purpose. It's about consciously creating those experiences that invite connection and expansion.
And what about conflict resolution? Zukov seems to say that disagreements shouldn't be these battles you're trying to win, but more like opportunities for understanding and growth.
That's a powerful shift, isn't it? It's about moving away from blame and defensiveness, approaching conflict as a chance to make the relationship stronger.
So instead of trying to win an argument, we use it to learn more about each other and about ourselves. And that can really strengthen the connection. It's a pretty radical thought, but it makes sense when you think about it. And finally, Zukov is really emphasizing individual growth. It's about encouraging each other's passions and independence, realizing that when each person grows, the relationship benefits as a whole.
That's such a key point. It's about letting each person flourish as an individual while still nurturing that connection between them.
So we've talked about a lot, but let's take a minute to recap what we've learned. Vertical relationships, they take effort. They take a commitment to growth, both personally and as a couple. It's about moving past those surface level connections and creating something that's really meaningful.
And what's truly amazing is that when both people are willing to face their own shadows, those hidden parts of themselves, they can help each other on the journey to becoming whole. That's where the real magic happens.
I love that. It's like the relationship becomes this place where personal and spiritual transformation can occur. Now, there were some things from The Seed of the Soul that really resonated with me. Zukov talks about how important it is to handle addictions within relationships, and he defines addiction in a really interesting way.
He doesn't just stick with that typical view of addiction, like it's only about substance abuse. He goes broader. Says it includes any behavior you feel compelled to do, any behavior that stops you from being self-aware, that hinders your spiritual growth.
So that could be like what? Workaholism, always needing validation from other people, endlessly scrolling social media.
Exactly. It's not always about these big dramatic behaviors, those destructive ones. Sometimes it's more subtle, the ways we avoid real closeness. Or always needing to be right. Even just constantly looking for distractions. All these things can stop us from connecting with ourselves and our partners.
And the vertical path talks about how those addictive patterns cause all sorts of problems in relationships, right?
Oh, yeah.
Codependency, manipulation, not being truly vulnerable,
Yeah.
they all come from those deeper issues.
Exactly. And this is where Zukov's ideas overlap with some pretty fascinating psychological theories, like attachment theory. It was developed by John Bowlby, and it looks at how what happens in our early childhood, those early experiences, shape how we relate to others later on.
So if you didn't get consistent love and care as a kid, you might end up with these insecure attachment styles.
Right.
And that makes it harder to form those healthy, trusting relationships as an adult.
Exactly. So you have these early experiences, and they kind of create a blueprint for how you approach intimacy, how you connect with people, even years later.
And those patterns can often turn into those addictive behaviors.
Yes. Clinging to partners, pushing them away, always looking for that validation to fill some kind of void Like you're trying to fix those unmet needs.
It's like we're trying to recreate those old dynamics, hoping for a different result, but often we just get stuck in the same cycle.
Yeah.
Same pain, same disconnection.
That's a really good way to put it. And this is where Zukav's focus on spiritual growth becomes so important. He's not saying to just ignore those painful things or push them down. It's about acknowledging them, seeing their impact, and then making a conscious decision to choose a different path.
So it's not about breaking those bad habits. It's about healing the stuff underneath,
Yeah,
the stuff that drives those habits in the first place.
exactly.
And that's where things like mindfulness and conscious communication can be so powerful, right?
Yes.
When we become more aware of our thoughts, our feelings, how we're acting, we can interrupt those automatic patterns. We can start making more conscious choices.
It's like we're taking back control.
It reminds me of Viktor Frankl's work, logotherapy. He was all about finding meaning in suffering. And it's like those addictive patterns, as painful as they are, they're also a chance to grow, to change.
You're absolutely right. It's about seeing those patterns, recognizing them, and then making a different choice. One that leads to, growth and freedom, both as individuals and as a couple. And Zukov says, remember, saying you can't resist is saying you want permission to act irresponsibly.
It's a powerful reminder that we always have a choice, even when it feels like we're trapped by those compulsions. And choosing to act responsibly, well, that's crucial for growth, both for ourselves and for the relationship.
And that brings us to self-efficacy, which is a psychological concept that ties in perfectly here. Albert Bandura, he's the one who developed this theory, and he emphasizes how important it is to believe in your own ability to make a difference, to influence things.
So when you have a strong sense of self-efficacy, you're more likely to face challenges head-on, with confidence and determination.
Exactly, including those urges to do the addictive behavior.
So it's not just about willpower. It's about really believing that you can change, that you can grow. And that can be so empowering, especially in relationships.
Absolutely. And when partners encourage each other, when they help each other develop that self-efficacy, it's like this positive cycle starts.
They help each other make those healthier choices.
Yeah.
And that makes them believe even more in themselves and their ability to, overcome those obstacles together.
It's a beautiful thing, isn't it?
It really is. This cycle of growth and empowerment. Now, I want to shift gears a little bit and think about how Zukav's ideas connect with sociology. I'm thinking about symbolic interactionism in particular. It's all about how we create meaning through social interactions.
That's a great connection. Symbolic interactionism tells us that a lot of our behaviors, even our addictions, are shaped by those social norms, the relationships we're in.
So, like, if you're constantly surrounded by messages that reinforce unhealthy patterns, you're more likely to fall into them.
Right. It's like those patterns get woven into the fabric of our society. But Zukov offers a way out. He says, by cultivating that authentic power, that power that comes from aligning what you do with your values, with your deepest intentions, we can actually break free from those limiting social scripts.
We can create new stories for ourselves and our relationships. Stories that are more empowering.
Precisely. It's realizing that you have the power to choose differently, to step outside those predefined roles, and to build relationships based on real connection, on shared growth.
And that makes me think of Irving Goffman's idea of the true self versus the performed self.
Yes, those masks we wear in different social situations.
Right. It seems like Zukav's saying that to have a healthy relationship, you have to be willing to take off those masks, to show your true self, even the parts that are messy, imperfect.
It's about being authentic, being vulnerable, and that needs a lot of trust and acceptance from your partner.
It's about making a space where both people feel safe to just be themselves, completely, without worrying about being judged or rejected. That kind of openness can be so freeing, so transformative. Now, it's important to remember that Zukav's work doesn't just stand alone. His ideas connect with a whole bunch of psychological and philosophical frameworks.
You're absolutely right. And one really strong example is Carl Jung's concept of the shadow self. Jung said that we all have this hidden side, a part of us that holds all the stuff we think is unacceptable, that we don't want to see.
And that's just like what Zukov talks about, right? Confronting our own shadows in relationships.
Exactly. Both Zukov and Jung are emphasizing how important it is to acknowledge those shadow parts, to integrate them, not try to get rid of them or pretend they're not there.
Because if we don't, those parts will come out anyway,
Yeah.
right? In unhealthy ways.
Yeah.
And that can really sabotage our relationships.
Exactly. But when we bring those hidden things into the light, when we become aware of them, that's when we can start to heal them, to make them part of who we truly are.
So it's not about pretending we're perfect. It's about embracing those imperfections and letting them help us grow, help us change.
And that's where the vertical path becomes this amazing journey of self-discovery, of supporting each other. It's about creating a space where both partners feel safe enough to explore those deeper parts of themselves and to help each other through the tough times, the challenges that come up.
And that brings us back to authentic power. It's not about control or being perfect. It's about honesty with ourselves and with our partners. It's about taking responsibility for our choices. And it's about showing up in our relationships with vulnerability and a genuine desire to grow. Now, I want to shift our focus to something a bit more practical. We've talked about all this theory behind these vertical relationships, but how do we actually, put this into practice in our own lives? How do we make that shift from horizontal to vertical and build those relationships that actually help us grow and evolve?
Well, I think it all starts with self-awareness. Take some time to really think about your own patterns in relationships. What are you good at? What are your weaknesses? What needs do you have that aren't being met? And how do those show up in your relationships? How you interact with other people?
It's like taking stock of all your emotional baggage, right?
Yeah.
Not always the most fun thing to do, but probably pretty important if you want to understand how those past experiences are shaping your relationships now.
Exactly. And once you have a better grasp on yourself, then you can start looking at the dynamics in your relationships. Are you communicating in an authentic way? Are you and your partner, are you supporting each other's growth? Are you dealing with those conflicts in a healthy way?
And I imagine that's where it gets tricky, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like it's one thing to say, okay, I see these unhealthy patterns, but it's another thing to actually change them.
It takes work,
Yeah.
conscious effort, and you have to be willing to get out of your comfort zone. But Zukov, he gives us some practical things we can do. He talks about setting boundaries, learning to say no, and making self-care a priority.
So it's not about being selfish. It's about realizing that you need to take care of yourself first
Yeah,
so that you can be fully present, in your relationships.
exactly. And it's also about, learning how to communicate what you need in a way that's clear, assertive. It's about having those tough conversations, but doing it with compassion and understanding, not just blaming each other or being manipulative.
This reminds me of nonviolent communication
Yeah.
that was developed by Marshall Rosenberg. It's about expressing your needs and your feelings, but without judging or criticizing. And it's about listening to the other person, really hearing their needs and feelings with empathy.
That's a great connection.
Yeah.
Nonviolent communication, it's such a powerful tool. It can help you deal with conflict in a way that actually brings you closer instead of pushing you apart.
And it's not just about how we talk to each other. Zukav also says those shared experiences are important, the ones that foster growth and connection.
Right.
What would be some examples of that?
Well, it could be a lot of things, taking a meditation class together, volunteering for a cause you both believe in, even just spending time out in nature, away from all those distractions.
The key is that you're doing it on purpose. You're making a choice to connect on a deeper level, to support each other's spiritual growth. So as we wrap up this deep dive into vertical relationships, I want to leave you with a few things to think about. First, remember, healthy relationships, they're a journey, not a destination. There can be bumps along the way, challenges, victories. The important thing is to face all those experiences with an open mind, with a willingness to learn and grow together.
And remember that you get to choose what kind of relationships you want. It starts with knowing yourself, understanding those patterns, your own needs. And then it's about communicating clearly, setting those boundaries, and creating those shared experiences that, help you both grow and connect.
And don't forget to be authentic, be vulnerable. Embrace those messy parts of yourselves and let your partner do the same. That's where you find real intimacy, real connection. If you're feeling inspired to explore these ideas further, I definitely recommend checking out Gary Zukavs' books, The Seed of the Soul and The Vertical Path. And for those of you who want to dive deeper into the psychology and sociology we've been talking about, be sure to check out John Bowlby, Carl Jung, Marshall Rosenberg, and Viktor Frankl. A big thank you to our expert for taking us on this fascinating journey. And to you, our listener, thank you for being here. Keep those vertical paths in mind as you navigate your own relationships. Until next time, keep exploring, keep growing,